See, as Christians, we often make the statement, things like, it's not about the destination, it's the journey. So we justify the journey in the desert because God once upon a time spoke about, let my people go so they may worship me in the wilderness. But then God spoke again. So we hold on to the promise of, well, we'll take wilderness then, but God says, I've got more for you, and we stay in the wilderness. He says, I've got so much more for you. See, before they could advance or take the hill country or take possession of their land, they had to learn something they'd always struggled with, trusting God. So there's this beautiful story of the book of Exodus. Read it. It's glorious. It's God's journey of his people through those 40 years. It's the Exodus. Them leaving slavery and getting to freedom. But they never get into the promised land in that story. But right at the end, the last 2 verses of the Exodus. Can I read them to you? Then the cloud covered the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. Moses could not enter the tent of meeting because the cloud had settled on it, and the glory of the Lord filled the tabernacle. In all the travels of the Israelites, whenever the cloud lifted from above the tabernacle, they would set out. But if the cloud did not lift, they did not set out until the day it lifted. So the cloud of the Lord was over the tabernacle by day, and fire was in the cloud by night, and in the sight of all the Israelites during all their travels. What's happened? In 40 chapters and 40 years, God has taken a people who would not listen, a people who stubbornly chose their own safety, stubbornly chose to not see their God, and he taught them to be a people who trusted that when the cloud by day or the fire by night moved, they would begin to move. And if it didn't move, they would stay. Who are we? We are called to be people who, when God moves, we move. When God doesn't move, we don't move. We are people who follow God. That's what he's looking for. That's what he always wanted from his people. He wanted a people who would trust him. So he's still looking for. See, God is looking for people. When he moves, they move. When he calls, they respond. When he speaks, they listen. Because ultimately, that's what trust is. See, what fights trust? Arrogance. I know better. What fights trust? Pride. I've got this. It's about me. Self-sufficiency, self-obsession, even insecurity about God. You see, there's still a call, church, today. And it's holiday time and it's cold outside. And maybe we just want to go home and get in blankets. But I want to tell you, there's still a call. Break camp, take the hill country and take possession of the land. Why? Because the kingdom of God comes before my daily bread. And when I get that, I start living a bigger story called the gospel of Jesus Christ. I start making decisions based on where is my king moving and how is he leading me rather than what looks convenient right now, because often a desert looks convenient. Why? Because my little water pound over there, I've got my tree over my head. Forget the fact it could die tomorrow, and I've got my tent and I'm good at this. God's saying, I never made you for the wilderness. See, we settle. Manna and quail looks good after 10 years of eating it. You find 17 different ways to eat it. But it was never meant to be a full meal for God's people. It was never meant to be a satisfying story for God's people. See, they had community in the desert. They even had worship, and yet God kept calling them to the promised land. Breaking camp's not easy. It demands something. One story, and then we're done. There's a guy named Peter Milne. He was part of a movement in the late 1800s, early 1900s called the One-Way Missionaries. They were called the One-Way Missionaries because they would buy a one-way ticket to lands where others had been persecuted or killed to preach the gospel. They were so committed and convinced that the gospel needed to reach that they laid their life down to reach. And he went to a place called the New Hebrides, where headhunters lived. And every other missionary who had gone there died. He bought his one-way ticket. And he lived there for 50 years until he died. And the tribe that he'd ministered to and preached the gospel to buried him. And they said this, and they put this on his tombstone. They said, when he came, there was no light. When he left, there was no darkness. I got to walk around Durban, where I've done most of my life. Where we left the jobs we loved and the careers to do something we felt God called us. It's not everyone's story. It was our story. And God graciously took me with my boys, and and we met Ian, a man whose life was a mess when we met him. And my little boy Judah asked questions, and he sometimes gets frustrated that our family do so much church because we generally here all day Sunday. And he's processing that. But then I started to tell him about Ian's story and how we had the privilege of being something a part of that. And then he asked questions about my mate who is graciously taken us on holidays and loved us. He's, why, Dad? And I got to tell him about the story when that guy gave his life at 22 years old, an arrogant model accountant. He had everything going for him. And how we loved that guy in our home, in our life group for year after year, every Tuesday night, dirting our house, drinking our Milo, using our 2-ply toilet paper. I got to tell my kid, and I tell him the details, because now he looks and he sees something and he doesn't know the story. See, we forget the stories of God's graciousness and kindness. We forget that He's used us to be a part of miracles. Sometimes I forget when I'm laying hands on people that God has done miracles before and He'll do miracles again. And it's got nothing to do with me. All He's looking for is faith. It's all He's looking for. Life Changers Church, God's got us on a story. Don't let it just be a macro story. Look at what our church are doing. Right now, it's more than that. The greatest testimony for me would be in your life and your story, that you would break camp today. Break camp. Break camp. Maybe you don't even know where you're going. I'm telling you, break camp. Pull up the tent pegs. Because God's got a different story. He's not called you to live in the wilderness. That was for a generation. We get to live with Jesus now. We get to live with His presence and His favor and His kindness. This is not some prosperity gospel preach. This is the truth about what it means to be a son or daughter of the living God.